So just a little bit about me. So I've been here at UBC since July. I was previously at Portland State University for the last 13 years, and I have had appointments in both civil engineering and planning. You can find more about my larger research agenda and things that I've worked on in my website, superlab.space. And my area of expertise is in transportation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And for the last several years, I've had some important international collaborations with the Technical University of Munich and the Instituto Superior Técnico at Lisbon in Portugal. And then I've had some really important collaborations at Portland State particularly with the Portland Bureau of Transportation, where we've worked on a number of different problems there. And then I would say also with Caltrans, which is the Department of Transportation for California. And then just a little bit about the fun things I like to do besides work. I really like live music. I do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day, at least for the last 30 years I have. I like to cook. I'm obsessed with the Postal Service. I aspire to be Postmaster General of the US, but I think Canada is there's only 40 million people here, so maybe it's a shorter path to think about Canada Post. I really like art, and I like to doodle and draw, which is kind of how I got to merge and transportation. So I do a variety of different things in terms of my research. One, I have worked for a number of years on maturing pedestrian modeling and pedestrian planning tools, thinking about demand modeling in particular. How do we forecast pedestrian demand? I am teaching a class this term and have a long-term interest in those connections between transportation, land use, and health. Thinking about travel behavior, what are the things that we do and how do we travel to get to them? Some work in technology and cities and smart cities, but particularly thinking about how in transportation we collect the kinds of data that we need and want to analyze for our research and to make better decision-making in cities. And then this particular topic, which I'm going to emphasize a little bit today, about transportation and land development and how we try to coordinate those two. So in that domain, my motivating questions are thinking about what are the links between the built environment that we create and travel behavior that we realize or that we aspire for people to engage in. And how can we manage new urban growth in ways that are more equitable, sustainable, and healthful for our population? And then in the nitty-gritty, where are we as a practical practicing community creating barriers both on the engineering side and on the planning side in achieving those new visions for something that's more equitable, healthful, and sustainable? So one of the questions that I've been working on with Portland Bureau of Transportation is their impact fee program. In Portland, it's called Transportation System Development Charges for a long, complicated reason I won't get into. Sometimes they're called development charges, called different things in different places. And these are fees that are assessed usually one time on a developer to recover the cost for expanding new infrastructure for this new demand that's coming from development. And developers and you, or we as residents, pay for this often for different categories of infrastructure. So water and wastewater, drainage and flood control, parks and recreation, and transportation infrastructure, probably some other things depending on your location. And these can be quite expensive or prohibitive for developers. And depending on whether you are a big developer or a little developer, depends on how cost prohibitive that might be. So if you're thinking about a single family home in Portland, that can come up to $20,000 per unit, which again, may or may not be a lot, depending on how you're framing this. And then in Portland in particular, so thinking about office buildings, an office building fees can be anywhere from $30,000 to $80,000. And I became particularly interested in this around a couple of reasons. So what infrastructure are we planning for, and are these fees used for? And then also, how do these costs come into play when we're talking about things like affordable housing? And are there differences in how we assess these fees on different types of development? And so transportation impact fees are based on estimates of how much additional demand, and demand usually measured by trips, is that new facility or building or land development going to generate. And so how have we, or how have engineers typically assessed this additional demand? The industry standard in the United States anyway, and I think for some places in Canada, is the Institute of Transportation Engineers Trip Generation Handbook. And there's a trip generation manual that provides the data. So one is a methodology and the other is different data. And these data are numbers of trips. And so these data have been compiled since 1968 and collected either from municipalities and from developers in their process of assessing new development, and in some cases from researchers such as myself. Historically, they've only been focused on vehicle trips. So vehicle trips are the only thing that matter or count as a trip in these data. And they are organized based on different land uses that you are thinking about developing, but there's no information in there on the socio-demographics of the area or the residents of the new development. The land use categories don't differentiate from market rate housing, for example, and social housing or affordable housing. My favorite example to show is there's one category for a donut shop, and there's another category for a bagel shop. I think I'm probably not the only one that thinks that this is maybe a little overly fine tuning when, so anyway, the land use categories could use some help. In some cases, they're overspecified. In some cases, they're underspecified. And then again, historically, you couldn't make any adjustments. So if you are building said donut shop in downtown Vancouver, it would generate, in terms of the data for the square footage of donut shop, the same number of trips, automobile trips, as if it were located in suburban Surrey, for example. So there's no ability to look at the urban characteristics around it that might influence travel. And then there's no data for other modes. So just vehicle trips, the only thing that we cared about thinking about. So this raised a lot of research questions for me, and I would say for the entirety of my time at Portland State, I was chipping away at the ITE trip generation manual as maybe, I'm going to say it out loud, maybe junk science. So that we were being overly specific and over-reliance on this one tool that maybe had some value, but the thing I keep saying to ITE is, are we not engineers? Can we not handle more complexity in this approach? I've done a lot of research with collaborators to start to chip away at this. So trying to understand what the relationship between the social context and the built environment and trip generation. We've used this in Portland to also make the case as new development was coming online to businesses that non-auto users are consumers that do spend quite a lot. So we added that expenditure study to our trip generation study. We've looked at trip generation and the provision of parking and also vehicle kilometers traveled. And then we've developed a new approach that's not based, that's mode agnostic, that starts with people. And so what is a person trip approach? And then we as a community, as planners and as a community, can decide what the mode distribution we would like in that area. How would we like those people to arrive at the new development? And so in one of our case studies, we were looking at supermarkets in particular. And so ITE's handbook predicted this many trips per hour. And so as we started to control for other factors, so one of our critiques of ITE is they never sunset data. So data was just compiled, and a rate that you got for a particular land use was an accumulation of data since 1968, as if nothing ever happened or changed since then. So when we took out the the old data and refresh with the new, we see that the trip rate came down. When we adjusted and said we're overinflating and over providing for the peak hour of travel, came down again. Then when we adjust for the income of the area, we get something more, comes down yet again. And then controlling just generally for the environment. So suburban, sort of quasi or somewhere between suburban and urban, we also see these big differences. So part of the reason why we've been producing such auto-oriented environments in the United States is we assume and that this is how much travel demand a new development is going to generate by car. And we've been planning and providing for that much demand, when in reality, it's more like this. So we found that in some cases, we're over predicting cars by 1,000%. So this kind of outraged me, and I've been on my soapbox about this ever since. And so been working with trying to change practice. So what's an alternative to this? And how can we start to think about a new way forward? But in many cities in the United States in particular, they mandate this approach. It's actually mandated in their legislation. And they also mandate which version of the ITE trip generation manual you have to use. And then people have been successfully using the trip generation manual to block new development or cap new development. So in many ways, developers could have built more intensely on land, but often reduce the scope of their project to avoid some of the fees, in part, that are charged based on these data. So these data are propping up NIMBYs from encouraging more multifamily development. And then the findings from my research and others who have been working on this, I think, need to be more widely communicated, both to practitioners, but also to advocacy and community groups, so that we can start thinking how to coordinate these two things in different ways. And so I've been frustrated with, why is this so slow to change? And then the last several years at Portland State, I've been an administrator, I've been the associate dean for research and then the associate vice president for research, and thinking about the role of universities in advocating for change and in communicating our work and our general value as public institutions to taking on these grand challenges. And so our current challenges of equity and climate change are going to require drastic changes in behavior, and we are going to need people to change behavior quickly. And at the same time, experts are starting to lose credibility amongst the public. And I think this is maybe more of a US problem, but faith in universities. So why should we be paying so much money for our children to attend college? And are we getting value out of that? And then the other thing is, as researchers, we're often only communicating to each other. So I give a technical talk at a technical academic conference, and we applaud ourselves for how smart we are. And that work never gets out of that sort of cycle of academic land. And so better outcomes are going to require more people to understand these things. And so I've been thinking about, how can we do this? How can we start to communicate what we do in other ways? And I ran into comics as one mechanism to do that. And you might ask, well, why comics? There might be other ways. I'm going to tell you why I got excited about comics, rather by accident. So I was never a big comic consumer as a kid, but I was always taking classes on art and drawing and painting. And in the middle of the pandemic, I had run through all of the online classes. I did not want to take an online drawing and painting class, but I took an online class, continuing ed class from the community college on comics, just for fun, because the timing worked and I was by myself, and like all of us looking for something to do besides Zoom at work. So I took this class. And the first day of the class, they started talking about the theory of comics, which I also was a little skeptical about. There's a theory of comics. And so the first day they started talking about why this is important. And so pardon me if this seems pedestrian, and you were all on already knew this, but first of all, images, we know this. Images can help explain complex ideas, and we've all seen some iteration of this image about why having transit is more effective than single occupant vehicles in terms of efficiency and road space, for example. And so I don't even have to explain this too much, except maybe tell you that this is supposed to be high capacity transit. This is people on bikes or in a bike lane, and these are people in single occupant vehicles. And you can intuit the rest from the image without words. This is an image that my instructor, and this is really what launched the whole thing, showed me on the first day of class, which is an image from R. Crumb, who you may or may not know, but he was a comic artist from the 70s. And this is called A Brief History of America, I believe. And so there's no words in this, and he pointed that out. And he asked us in class, how many words would it take to explain what's happening in this image? And so I raised my hand and I'm like, well, I teach the course on transportation and land use, and it takes about 10 to 16 weeks, depending on the format. But you all can sort of see the progression of what's happened here quite clearly in a simple 16 frame image with 0 words. So really powerful to explain complex ideas. Then in the idea of comics is about sequencing. So how do you tell a story from panel to panel? And comic artists talk about how all the action or the passage of time happens in this space. Anybody know? Anybody comic aficionado know what the space between? This is called the gutter. And so the gutter is where all the passage of time happens. It's also where all the learning happens, because your mind has to transition from one image, one static image to the next. So your mind makes that leap of what happened here. So it's where you show passage of time or also evolution of concepts. So sequencing and how we sequence those images helps promote understanding. Here's another example from a Canadian comic artist, Ryan Martinson, who is also a transportation engineer. So he does a lot of comics about transportation. So just simple three panels to explain like the importance of how a space changes from night to day and what are some interventions that we might do. You probably don't need the words even. The other reason that comics are a powerful communication tool is what's called permanency, or they're permanent. And so the pace in which a reader takes in information is determined by them, which is unlike you guys. You have to hear what I'm saying at the pace in which I'm spewing it out, right? Or if you're watching a film or a movie, the pace at which information is given to you is determined by the film. In comics, one reason why kids like them is you can digest that information at your own pace, and the interplay between words and images, and often there's double entendres and Easter eggs and all kinds of things hidden in those images. So books are also permanent in this way, but don't use and don't condense the interplay between words and images in that economic way. And then finally, why I think they're particularly powerful in urban planning is it's a mechanism for having better representation of people and better representation of environments and the kinds of activities that people might be doing, or that we might not see because we haven't planned for them, but we can sort of articulate that vision within comics and also translate them to other languages and other contexts more readily. Okay, so I was sold, and I said, how do I get in on this? So I collaborated with my longtime collaborator and former PhD student, Christina Currens, who's now a faculty member at the University of Arizona. And we said, we've been looking at this question of ITE and like, these big questions, and like, where do we get started? Like, we have a lot to say, don't know really how to move ahead. So we actually got a grant, like you do, and hired my comics instructor as our editor. And so he is an expert in nonfiction comics. He's right now working on his own comic biography of Muhammad Ali, but he's worked with people in the health professions. in different types of municipalities trying to communicate different aspects to community groups. So he has a ton of experience. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. I'm very excited here. And then Portland State has a comic studies program. So Portland is a big comics town. Dark Horse Comics is based there. And so in the English department, they have a comic studies program. And so I actually got the director of that program, Susan Kirtley, to help us with narration and the storytelling piece. So most comics don't have such heavy hitters joining us. And then we hired as our graduate research assistant, Joaquin Golez, who was a studio artist, and he did all the art for us in the comic. So a truly interdisciplinary team. And we all learned a lot from each other as part of this process, but it took a long time for us to get on the same page, so to speak. And the first thing that we had to do is say, well, what is it that we want to say? And Christy and I spent a lot of time with charts and graphs and doing our academic speak. And I think the studio artist, which is like, snooze, boring. So this was actually the hardest part for us, is sort of distilling down, like, what are the most salient points that we want to try to make in this comic. So we decided that we wanted to sort of distill it into 3 bits and 3 chunks. So first of all, how did it become all about the car? Like, how did we get to this point? So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of this process, because it started off with good intentions and perhaps naive intentions about how far it would go into the future. So we started with a little bit about the past. Then we said, how did we end up with this crappy built environment? And I think that's the working title that stuck. So how does this influence what's going on in the built environment? And then finally, adding some narratives and experiences from people in the public and how they interpret and might understand, and their sort of lived experiences dealing with change. So not dealing with this as much as dealing with what we as planners are trying to do with adding more bike lanes, adding more transit, building an apartment building with no parking, and the conflicts that arise there. And so as part of this process, we divided it into these 3 narratives. And then on each page, Ryan said, tell us what the point is of each page. And again, this has really changed the way I think about writing and the way I think about communicating. And maybe, again, a lot of you have always approached writing in this way. We found it really hard, really challenging. So the economy of words and just the nugget of what's going to happen in the page. And then we went from that to sort of writing a script. So what do we want each specific panel? And we would iterate between text. And then we would have different, these are called panels, not cells. Comic artists get very mad when you talk about cells. And we would mock up some things and do these thumbnails, and then we would iterate back and forth. And this took months of iteration. And getting, again, words down. I would say if you're looking at the comic now, we could have edited even more. So how do we get it down to this nugget? One of the things that we had was really important at 2 different stages here was having a technical advisory committee. So these were made up of other academics and practitioners, so transportation planners and engineers. And we asked them 4 questions at 2 different points in this. Is what we're saying true? Are we communicating the essentials? So you don't have to worry about some of the narrative or the fact that my cat's in every page, but like, are we communicating the essentials that you would want the public to know? Is it clear and easy for you to understand as, again, a planner or engineer? And then did you enjoy it? It was the most important thing. So did you think it was an interesting read? We also had a community advisory committee. So one of those committees was in Portland, Oregon, and it was a neighborhood association that collaborated with us. The other was in Tucson, Arizona. So a very different environment and a very different community. And we asked them similar sets of questions. So did this make sense to you? Is the language, we have the comic in English and Spanish. So is it free of jargon? And is it easy for you to understand? Do you see yourself in the story? So is there broad representation of the public in there? And then also, did you enjoy it? So we had key feedback, again, from these two groups at two particular times in the process. Then last fall, we did actually we did a workshop at Portland State with students and faculty and this group of characters here, as well as Casey McKenney, who's a faculty in planning at Portland State. And she's done a comic on changing the narrative about homelessness and communicating stories of the unhoused. And so how can other people turn their research into comics? And then we offered an undergraduate course. So I was here when the course was offered, but super excited that it was going on. And it was an interdisciplinary course that students in engineering, the sciences, and the arts could all get together and take. And at the end, they made a comic. And it counted as a communications course for undergraduates or a science course if you were in the arts. So it was a fun and surprisingly difficult thing to pull off at the university level. Okay, what have I learned in this process? Again, academics, we communicate with nuance. In fact, we teach our students, to be PhD students in particular, to be very careful about the conclusions that they draw from data and to be very nuanced. And there are always caveats and limitations. And this can be really confusing when you're talking to the public. And you might say, well, yeah, Kelly, of course, like, we don't get you. You're just learning this out. But it really became hard when we're trying to distill what we're doing to just a few pages. But the effort of putting this into a story and a narrative makes the work more compelling and actually allows us to put some of that nuance and complexity back into the narrative. Interdisciplinary work is really challenging. So it's not just getting people in the room. You have to spend a lot of time learning each other's language. None of this could have been completed. So if our editor dropped out, if I dropped out, if Joaquin, the illustrator, dropped out, we couldn't have succeeded in creating the comic. But I would say we developed the actual comic in about 3 months. It took us the rest of the year to get on the same page about what we were doing, and so that everybody understood what everybody was talking about. And then finally, I think this is a really compelling avenue for planners to explore, and I've applied for more funding to do this here in Canada on a variety of different topics, so not just transportation topics. But I think the next bit for me would be then using this as a tool, an engagement tool with communities that are interested in change. And so for that reason, the comic is actually free. So there's hard copies back there, but you can download the comic in Spanish and English and freely distribute it either to people in the community. We hope that public agencies put it on their website, and you can also use it in your class. And so if you'd like to know more about it, you can also check out my website. And I'm teaching transportation and health. So thanks, everyone.